there's very few topics in international relations and in India's foreign policy that have got more interest than India's relationship with the Maldives. You might remember that this year we started with a major diplomatic controversy between India and the Maldives after the election of President Mohamed Muizzu to office. It was, several ministers in the Maldivian government were suspended for saying things that were derogatory to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It became a massive controversy that splashed all over the Indian media and, of course, had an impact on the relationship with the Maldives as well. Indian troops were asked to leave the shores of the Maldives. That was the narrative at the start of the year, that there was something seriously wrong in India-Maldives relations. And just this week, we have had the visit of Maldivian President Mohamed Muizzu, and it seems in some senses that all seems to be forgiven in the India-Maldives relationships, that things seem to be back on track. Joining us now to decode what has happened in this roller coaster of India-Maldives relations over the last year is someone who studies the country closely and has been to the Maldives himself, Aditya GS, who is at the Observer Research Foundation, someone I'm sure you will have all got very used to as he's here with us in India Today Global so much. Aditya, thank you so much for joining us. Could you begin by just walking us through this last year, 2024, in the relationship between India and the Maldives? How did it start? Walk us through this controversy that happened and where we seem to have reached now in the bilateral relationship. A lot of people seem to be talking about, is all forgiven in the India-Maldives relationship? Are we back to normal now?
Thank you, Shashank. Well, I wouldn't start with an optimistic state by stating it that we are back to normal. I would say we are in the new normal, because there has been a lot that has happened in the 1 year, and obviously a lot has happened between India and Maldives, and we'll have to define and redefine our bilateral relationship and redefine our red lines, our security concerns. And Maldives also has to understand where it can talk to India, where it has to be more sensitive to India. So I think, and this visit has perfectly put that in picture. You are right? Last year we began almost a year ago. Muizzu was elected to power. Once he was elected, he went on to go on with his anti-India rhetoric, despite being elected to power. For the first 3-4 months of his foreign policy, he was consistently pushing for diversification, more diplomatic engagements with China, obviously, and also somewhere down the line, he was indirectly pointing to India, calling India a bully, telling that we'll have to cut down our dependence on India. Right? A lot was said and done. And what happened in the meantime was that the economic the country's economic situation was in a bad state. And at the same time, Muizzu also got a parliamentary majority, which meant that he didn't have to go with certain rhetoric that he was usually adopting for the last 3-4 months of his tenure. So following that, when the country was also in the bad crisis, they think there was a hard realization that expectations from China were not being fulfilled. China was not willing to offer new loans. China was not willing to offer mega infrastructure investments, but what it was rather trying to do is offer grants. And it had also promised to look at debt restructuring, but nothing concrete has come out from Jan yet. So that was one thing that we should have, we looked at. And then at the same time, the imports that were supposed to come from Turkey, in terms of food imports, they never came when it was intended to come, because of the crisis happening in Red Sea. So I think there was a hard realization even in the Maldivian foreign policy that we can try to diversify our relations, but we can only diversify to a limited extent, because India is a major player and no one will fill that vacuum in that region. And hence began the reconciliation, followed, started with Musa Zamir's visit to India, and then followed by back-to-back visits, from Maldives and India, and then we had Muizzu visiting on a state visit here, which again, as I said, puts the bilateral relations on the right track. But there is a lot to do and a lot to be built upon from what has happened with this visit.
Understood. So you're delivering a bit of a reality check there in terms of where the relationship is right now. Could I ask you a little bit about that? Let's start with talking about the man himself, Mohamed Muizzu. Lots has been written about him in India. Some people have called him anti-India, others have called him pro-China. He himself calls himself pro-Maldives. He really made his name and made headlines in India by very publicly stating that Indian troops should be asked to leave the Maldives. It was suggested that they were in some ways a threat to the sovereignty of the country. His government then refused to renew a hydrography agreement with the Indian government. So these were a range of controversies that had taken place. There were also questions about who Muizzu really is, what he believes on India. There has always been in Moldavian politics this divide between politicians who are traditionally seen as pro-India and those who are seen as slightly more skeptical of India's influence. Could you talk a little bit about Muizzu, how where he comes from on his view on India? How did we get into this controversy in the first place, where he was talking about asking Indian troops to leave the Maldives, where he was talking about not renewing hydrography agreements with India? Could you talk about that? What laid the stage for this mistrust in the first place?
See, I think this whole problem with India doesn't date back to Muizzu, it doesn't date back to India Out campaign, but it dates back further beyond. That is in early 2000s when the GMR deal was politicized. Following that, there was
Could you also explain what the
Maldives was.
GMR deal was, just for our audience? Could you just explain the GMR
So
deal?
it was a deal that the Indian firm GMR had in terms of developing an airport in the Maldives, and eventually that was signed by Mohammad Nasheed, obviously, but eventually it went on to be politicized for certain taxes it was imposing. People came to politicize it, started saying that Nasheed has gone too close to India, and this is to help his friends in India. The deal was to basically compromise Maldives sovereignty. So these were some of the accusations that were laid. So anyone who has to deal with Maldivian society or understand Maldivian society and politics will have to understand that nationalism and politicization is one of the biggest things there. So all of these major investment projects have been in fact, with the emergence of the democracy in 2008, this has been a consistent feature that we'll continue to see. So the GMR deal, when it was made, and then there were this several politicians who ganged up against Nasheed and had this politicization of the project. And eventually, when Nasheed was ousted with the mass, protests erupting across the street, the successor came and withdrew the deal. The GMR deal was scrapped from by President Wahid, and after that, President Yamin came in. He tried getting more Chinese investment. So this is where this whole deal began, where Yamin wanted more mega infrastructure projects and more money, and that's where he found China. And further, when he went on to crack down democratic institutions in the country, India had its own concerns, Western countries had its own concerns, but China had no concerns as such, because China didn't care about democracy. China didn't care which state the country was heading to. And thus began, China, Maldives, Bonhomie, especially under Yamin. And then slowly what happened in the later years in 2017, when this democratic crackdown continued to intensify, Yamin also brought up this rhetoric of returning Indian aircraft. This is when it first surfaced, because again, as I pointed out, right from Nasheed days, India was a big player. India was a big development and security partner, and in fact, India had deployed one of its helicopters back in the day, and another one was deployed in Yamin's time, and then the third was discussed. That was the Dornier aircraft. That was again discussed under Yamin, but deployed under Soli's time. So when Yamin, just before the elections, Yamin went on to politicize these Indian helicopters there and wanted to send them back, and India was not willing to do it. So there was a lot of back and forth negotiations. India said the time that Yamin was giving was very non-pragmatic, which was basically a month's time to withdraw. So there was a lot of back and forth negotiations, and when finally Yamin lost and Soli won to power, Soli brought this India first policy. But on the other hand, Yamin went on to politicize these Indian investments, Indian projects, and then went on to call MDP as again a pro-India party, a party that compromises to Maldivian sovereignty, and all of these usual accusations that come with it. And this campaign sustained since 2020. It began from the opposition. It was already there on social media, run by opposition activists, but now it formally began in 2020 with the opposition's push, and it went on till 2023. Then Muizzu slowly took over the leadership of PPM PNC by sidelining Yamin, and then Muizzu continued to go on with this rhetoric. So there we also see two things. One, that PPM PNC has a very strong relationship with China that has remained unchanged. And then we also see PPM PNC having a lot of hopes on China. PPM PNC is the party of Yamin, having a lot of hopes on China. And now that China will invest, China is a proactive partner. China's delivery of projects is quite quick. and efficient. So that's their whole narrative and rhetoric, and that's where their differences with India also begin. And they continue to criticize India for, criticizing that India is involved in arm twisting, India involves in domestic politics. So trying to politicize MDP, sideline MDP, but also India at the same time. So that's where Muizzu came in. Muizzu took on to this anti-India rhetoric, continued to have a pro-China policy, asked India to withdraw its troops, which was a big promise that he made to his
Constituents, right?
constituency, and a big promise that he had made for people. And then he also cancelled the hydrography agreement, some of these projects which were politicized in the India Out campaign.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about then how did we get where we are right now? What we've seen, you of course talked about Muizzu using anti-India rhetoric, not refusing to renew a hydrography agreement, asking Indian troops to leave the Maldives, really tapping into a lot of this anti-India rhetoric. Now, of course, he comes to India and says that just this week, and comes and says that, look, India is a very close partner of the Maldives. It's a close maritime security partner. He's again opened up the conversation on defense cooperation. He's also asked for and received a massive economic relief package from India. What changed over this last year? Was it simply that Maldives has been going through something of a tough economic time, which made him change his view, or are there some domestic developments in the Maldives that have induced the president to change his view on India and to come to India and seek its friendship?
So I think a couple of things have happened. One, sorry. Sorry. So a couple of things have happened. One is the domestic politics. Obviously, Muizzu has won a majority in the parliament. And now he realizes that he will have to tone down his anti-India rhetoric, and that having that majority has given him a flexibility to have a kind of approach that he wants to have with India, and reverse certain decisions that he had made. Second, and most importantly, as you pointed out, the economic situation is in a really, really bad situation. The debt crisis. There is a foreign reserve crunch, and then the debts are piling up, especially from China, especially from external creditors and bondholders. So this is something that Maldives has to pay back, right? And they are maturing, and he has not been, and the country has not been able to generate enough foreign reserves because of several structural reasons. And then Muizzu also went on to add further fuel to the fire by appointing so many political appointments, expanding his cabinet, which is costing him approximately $65 million. All of these things have piled up, and then finally we also add that factor where I spoke about that no country has that capability and capacity or that willingness to fill in India's vacuum. There were a lot of expectations from China. There were a lot of expectations from Turkey. All the other countries that Muizzu wanted to diversify, but none of them have come back, right? So I think what happened finally was India's good gesture. India's positive signaling for a long, long time. Despite his anti-India rhetoric, India continued to show that it is a development partner. I think they were well noticed. They were well received, and I think there was a reconciliation in the making. They were planning to come back to India, and again, as I pointed out, this process began with Musa Zamir coming to India, the then foreign minister, followed by a lot of high-level visits, and then finally this visit here. Again, the fact that Muizzu has been able to get $700 million of assistance from India with a 400 million assistance worth US dollars, and then around 350 in Indian rupees is something that indicates that Muizzu has seen or is seeing India as a first responder and a responsible partner, and I think India has reciprocated to it.
Right. Could I ask you then to go back to what you said when we started this interview, right? You said that this is not back to normal, this is a new normal, and that there are still worrying signs in the relationship that we should not discount. You suggest that you were not yourself too optimistic. So could you talk a little bit about that? What do you think are some of the fault lines in this relationship that could lead to continued tensions? Because at least in this week, the prevailing narrative seems to be that the Maldives is back in the fold. What makes you think that that necessarily isn't the case?
See, I mean, I would say Muizzu's visit is definitely a good thing. It's a positive development, and it puts relations on the right track. But let's not forget that ideologically, Muizzu's party is still more inclined to China than it is to India. In fact, if you notice, these high-level visits happening from Maldives and China, it almost happens on a weekly basis. There are certain high-level visits happening from here to there, and from Communist Party of China to Maldives, from Maldives to China. So this is quite an ongoing thing. China has offered certain private investments. China has taken up certain smaller projects, community development projects. So all of these are happening, but in terms of major infrastructure projects is what China has not been able to deliver. In terms of debt restructuring process, China has not been able to deliver. Now, talking about debts, right? Out of the $8 billion that Maldives owes to its, that Maldives has borrowed and has to pay back, out of 1.2 billion has to go back to China, right? Which is the second biggest external creditor, followed by private lenders and treasury, bills and bonds, and that Maldives has borrowed. So in that case, Maldives will have to be sensitive to Chinese concerns. Maldives will have to adhere to certain guidelines that China is pushing, or certain tactics that China wants to employ. Muizzu will be subject to that pressure, domestically speaking, politically speaking, and as well as economically speaking. I think that leverage for China is still there. Now, what this relationship has done, what this visit has done, I would call it a win-win kind of a situation where Muizzu has come to China. He has got a $750 million assistance, but at the same time, he has also made sure that India has agreed to negotiate on a free trade agreement. He has also made sure that India will try to trade with Maldives in local currency. So all of these again will be beneficial to Maldives, because India is one of the biggest source of their imports. Now, if he gets this free trade agreement, trade will be cheaper. If he gets this deal in trading local currency, the pressure and the need to generate foreign reserves will reduce. And obviously, with the external the assistance that India has offered in terms of the $350 million that India has offered in terms of the currency swap agreement, that also it will be helpful to Muizzu, because that will help him import and export to India without much without much need of US dollars. So that also is something that will continue to fuel this bilateral relationship, and that is something that is hugely beneficial for Maldives at this point in time. On the other hand, for India, I would say India, at least for now, has uh, cracked the code on how to make more inroads into the Maldives. It has gotten back several projects or several initiatives or several sectors that India was about to lose, because Muizzu wanted to just diversify the relationship in terms of health cooperation, in terms of defense cooperation, in terms of hydrography surveying. So all of these things were, something that were being discussed, and Muizzu wanted to diversify. And then there was this port project, the Malay port, that was moving to certain that was being moved to certain island. Muizzu had had put for this project in Middle East, had put for this project in China, requesting for investments. So all of these projects were there, and they were being diversified away from India. Now India has gotten hold of these projects, and I think that's where India has learned that, one, respect Maldives sensitivities, or at least these government sensitivities of not having Indian troops, but still offering more and more defense assistance, right? And then at the same time offering more and more development assistance, and and also probably India has learned on how to take back certain of these projects and certain of these sectors that Muizzu wanted to diversify. So I think India's and Maldives have got a win-win in this relationship.
Understood.
Yes.
Could I ask you one last thing on the Chinese side of the equation? We've talked about, you hinted at it, and I'd like you to ask you to talk about that a little more, because, of course, a lot of conversation about India's aid package to the Chinese, to the Maldivians. What exactly has China been doing here? We know that China very recently came out and put out a statement saying that they would support the Maldives in its current economic crisis. Just again to inform our viewers, the problem with the Maldivian economy is that there are serious concerns about whether they have enough foreign exchange and resources to pay back a lot of the debts that they owe. A large amount of that debt is, of course, owed to China, and it is also owed to India. Now, India has, of course, agreed to provide a currency swap agreement to provide the Maldives the currency it needs, as well as other financial assistance. China has also come out and said that it will provide assistance to the Maldives. So, Aditya, could I ask you a little bit about how the Maldives has been playing, how China has been playing this game in the Maldives? What is the Chinese view of what's happening in the Maldives right now, and with regard to its competition with India?
See, I think again there were a lot of expectations from the Chinese side when Muizzu came to power, and then in Jan when Muizzu visited China, they went on to sign 20 MOUs. Maldives went on to become a part of Global Security Initiative. Maldives went on to sign the Defense Pact, and then there was a subsequent Chinese spy vessel that was docked in Mali. So all of these things showed that there is a growing cooperation between India and China. Now, two things, important things that you'll also have to notice is that the Kaddu airport, where India has deployed its, defense equipments, that is basically aircraft and also a batch of technical personnel who replaced the Indian military earlier this year. They are also stationed there, and this Kaddu airport is being upgraded or renovated, however you want to call it, by a Chinese firm. Now, similarly, India is also building a naval harbor in UTF, where again a Chinese firm has won a contract for making an agricultural zone near this within that island, right? So this is the problem. The problem was China had made inroads, and that China wanted to invest in certain places. But again, all of these have been smaller investments and smaller community development projects and smaller private investments rather than anything big. I think what has happened is that China promised a lot but has not been able to walk the talk. Also, probably because they don't want to get entangled into this whole economic situation that the Maldives is undergoing right now. Possibly fearing what has happened in Sri Lanka and the repercussions.
Aditya, I'm sorry to ask you. I'm sorry to ask you to tip your hand a little bit, but you have also been to the Maldives in recent times. Is that the sense that you get? That the sense is that the Chinese have talked a big game, but not necessarily delivered as much as they said they would. Is that the sense on the ground?
Under Muizzu, yes. Under Muizzu, yes. That has been a consistent, grievance of certain Maldivian politicians. Even if you talk to them, that China is not being able to walk the talk, right? I mean, it has promised a lot, but nothing of that has come to fructification yet. Even in terms of debt restructuring, the technical again, coming back to what China is doing in terms of financial assistance to the Maldives. They offered $130 million in grant, and that was it. That they said they will be using it for road redevelopment of roads in Malé and Vili Malé and other islands. But apart from that, nothing has happened. In fact, the Chinese ambassador went on to say that we will not be able to offer new loans because of the economic situation you are in. And in fact, if you decide to restructure the existing loans, that will also impact your future possibilities of borrowing new loans. What we could do at this point in time is offer you more grants. So this was a bland statement offered by the Chinese ambassador, and following which was, we also saw Musa Zamir visiting India. So that also shows that there is an understanding that China will not be able to deliver on a lot of its promises. In fact, China is pushing for more smaller projects, as I pointed out, rather than a bigger project or any kind of economic assistance that was planned. But now with Muizzu having tried to reset his ties, probably we can see China being more active. Possibly we can see China being more assertive in the in Maldives. We don't know, but I think for a sense that China will continue to push back. In fact, if we look at Sri Lankan case, when India offered debt restructuring, China was soon responded to it with its own restructuring deal, right? So now with Indian assistance coming in, we might possibly see China also reciprocating it in sometime soon. In fact, China was discussing of a grace period of 5 years for Maldivian loans. But that again, that was discussed back in Jan when Muizzu was in China, but nothing concrete has come out of that yet.
Understood.
So we'll have to wait and watch what is going to happen next.
So Aditya GS from the Observer Research Foundation, someone who studies the Maldives extremely closely, has been there telling us a little bit about how this new visit by President Muizzu to India shapes up the bilateral relationship, how China features into it. Thank you so much, Aditya, for joining us once again on India Today Global, and thank you so much to our viewers for tracking this story on India and the Maldives.